All right, everybody. Can everyone hear me? We've got our fancy new sound equipment, so I want to make sure everyone can hear me loud and clear. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for this evening's event, Meet the Author with William Martin. I'm Charlie McMahon, and tonight I speak not only as Pequot Library's programs manager, but also as a massive William Martin fan. So I first encountered Mr. Martin's written work while working as a clerk at the Brewster bookstore on Cape Cod during my high school summers. One day, while I should have been unpacking boxes in the back, I cracked open a copy of Cape Cod and was immediately transported to 17th century New England. A world of conflict and intrigue, plagued by questions of land ownership and culture clashes, rushed before my very eyes. From there, I quickly devoured absolutely everything Mr. Martin wrote. In Harvard Yard, in Beacon Hill, Back Bay rather, I became immediately fascinated by the protagonist, Peter Fallon. In many ways, he embodied traits I kind of wanted to embody myself, right? He was scholarly, academic, and loved history, which I'd like to think I can check those. But he's also heroic and adventuresome. And so who knows, I may have time for that, but as of now, the jury's out. To those of you unfamiliar, William Martin is the New York Times bestselling author of 12 novels, amongst other cultural contributions. Through his literature, Martin connects the past with the present, and in doing so, he perfectly illustrates the contemporary importance of our collective American history. Through the years, Martin has spoken for presidents and luminaries, and for tonight, Pequot Library. He's been collecting numerous awards, including, but not limited to, the New England Book Award, the Samuel Eliot Morrison Award, and the Robert B. Baker Award. Thank you all, again, for attending tonight's program. Original and innovative programming, such as this, is made possible thanks to donations and contributions from supporters such as yourselves. Pequot Library, and I say this at every program, but Pequot Library's funding is made up almost entirely of private donations. So thank you all so much. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Martin, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Charlie, for that introduction. I hope you didn't lose your job at Brewster Books because you got so... because, you know, once you pick up Cape Cod, you won't put it down. Or any of my books, I have to say. Thank you all for coming. It's been a pleasant trip down here to Connecticut. Got to play golf today with my brother-in-law, Dennis, and at the Weburn Country Club. We played pretty well in the pouring rain, and as the Irish call it, just a moist fog it was. And we said, if we were in Scotland or Ireland, we wouldn't care what the weather was. We'd be out there right now playing. So it was a very nice trip down. And then we come here to this beautiful building, which is really quite spectacular. And we were oohing and awing over the stacks and the special collections and all of the other treasures that you have here. So I'm here tonight to talk about my new novel, December 41. I think some of you have already read it. And I think that you might be interested in some of the backstory of how it came to be. Now, every novel has its own particular genesis. Every book will hit you in a different place in your brain, and you'll say, I have to write that. For example, with Back Bay, the story about Boston and a lost tea set sunk into the mud of the Back Bay of Boston. The idea came to me when I was in a 4th grade geography class, believe it or not. It might sound like a lot of baloney, but it's true. Miss Houghton's 4th grade geography class at the Robert Gould Shaw School in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, she described for us the way in which Boston had once been a tiny peninsula connected to the mainland by one little narrow neck of land. And then they decided that they would cut down all the hills and fill all the tide flats and create a much larger city. And the Back Bay was created by landfill that covered about a square mile of the city, the part of the city you now know as the Back Bay. And she said, you know, you can dig down into those basements of those old brownstones along Commonwealth Avenue, down through the basement, down into the landfill. And if you keep digging, you might come across a trash dump, because there were trash dumps there 150 years ago. And in those trash dumps, you'll find things that people threw out, pieces of old broken pottery, pencils, forks, things that would have been trash to them, but would be treasures to us. And I thought to myself in the 4th grade, what if there was real buried treasure under there? And 20 years later, when I was in Hollywood beating my head on the wall, not able to sell any of the screenplays that I had written, I dusted that idea off, and it became my first novel, which became a New York Times bestseller, which meant that I never had to have a real job again. Another of the books that I've written was born by simply trying to write down good opening lines, because I was so stumped. What am I going to do next? I know I'm going to write down a good opening line and see what happens. You know, I tried. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And I liked the poetry of it, but it didn't, it sounded too familiar. Call Me Ishmael. Who would name a main character Ishmael? Joseph Heller. He did it this way once with a book called Something Happened, which was the book that he wrote after Catch-22. He said he was lost. He couldn't come up with any ideas. And so he just wrote down the opening line, Something Happened. I never read this book. My father-in-law read it. I asked him, what did you think of that book? He said, nothing happened. So I wrote down the opening lines of Catholic confession. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It prompts a response. How long has it been since your last confession? And another response. So suddenly you have dialogue going back and forth. Even if you don't have anything happening, the dialogue says, oh, well, 6 weeks and 3 days. And when the priest hears that, he realizes that the guy on the other side of the screen is an Irish rebel who has come to Boston in the weeks before the Easter Rebellion to get weapons, the money for which the priest has been collecting, and get those weapons back to Ireland. And out of that, in like an afternoon, was born a novel, The Rising of the Moon. This book, December 41, was born in the movies. Chris and I were at the movie theater to see a movie that you've probably all seen, Darkest Hours, with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. And it's a great movie if you haven't seen it. And during this movie, about halfway through, right in the midpoint of the story, the structural midpoint where the character is going to confront his darkest crisis, Churchill goes down into the basement of the War Department and goes to the secure telephone line and picks it up and calls all alone down in that dark basement, calls Franklin Roosevelt and begs him for help. It's May of 1940. France is falling. The Germans are advancing on Dunkirk. All seems lost. He says, Mr. President, you've got to help us in whatever way you can. You need to send us aid, send us arms, send us soldiers, get into this fight. And FDR says, I can't help you, Winston. American politics ties my hands, but I wish you good luck. And Churchill hangs up the phone and slumps in despair, and the camera cuts back to a long shot. And as that camera cut back to the long shot, I thought to myself, in a year and a half, right after Pearl Harbor, those two men will stand together on the south portico of the White House to light the national Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. And what a target they will make. And there it was. Boom. I had my idea. A German assassin is going to try to kill them. That was it. Now all I have to do is fill in the blanks, right? That's only going to take me a couple of years to do. But the story immediately jumps to life. And the first question you have whenever you write a novel is, why here? Why now? And of course, there are many ways to answer this question. Why are these characters suddenly kicking into motion at this moment? And the now? Well, the now in this book is December 8th, 1941. That's the first day of the new world order for the world and for the American people. Pearl Harbor has been bombed, and now we're going to have to advance against the Germans and the Japanese. And I started writing because I wanted to give you a sense of what the world looked like on that day, that world historical day of December 8th, 1941. My mind began to spin a newsreel, and I wrote that for you, a newsreel that begins and you've probably seen these news of the world type newsreels that in the 1940s were the main source of visual news gathering for the world and for the people that would go to the movie theaters and see these newsreels. The camera begins in the far Pacific. It crosses the international date line, the place that divides yesterday from today. It travels toward Japan and down into Tokyo, where early on the morning of December 8th, 1941, the Japanese foreign minister goes to the emperor and presents to him a sheet of paper, the suspension of diplomatic relations between the United States and Japan. He tells the emperor, this sheet of paper will be given to the emperor, will be given to the Secretary of State in Washington in 90 minutes. In 2 hours, the bombs will start falling in Honolulu. And the emperor approves. The camera now picks up and travels in a northeasterly direction over Manchuria, which is now subjugated by the Empire of the Sun, over Manchuria, and then across the vast and empty canvas of Asian Russia. It picks up a train speeding across the landscape, a train loaded with Siberian troops rushing to the front where the Germans and the Russians are locked in fierce and mortal combat. It travels over Moscow. It travels just 12 miles to the point where the advanced detachments of Hitler's Wehrmacht have come to within sight of Moscow. Hitler has been planning a victory parade in the previous few days, but now the Russians have counterattacked and the battle is ferocious. The camera passes over the lands that the Germans have now conquered, over the Ukraine, over Poland, and then it spins down into a dank, pine-shrouded compound in East Prussia called the Wolfschanz, the eagle's lair, a wolf's lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters. Getting ahead of myself. We'll get to Hitler's Western White House in a minute. Believe it or not, they had plans for one, but historians tell us that on the night of December 7th, the bombs have started falling in Hawaii. On the night of December 7th, Hitler had been in a very bad mood because, of course, how would they know, though? Because the Russians on December 5th had launched the counterattack that was driving the Germans. Finally, the Germans who had advanced without stopping for the last 6 months are now being driven back. And he is saying that his generals are not up to the new winter crisis on the Eastern Front. And he's angry and he's grouchy. And then he receives word that Pearl Harbor has been bombed. And he perks up, according to Goebbels' diary. He perks up and says, this is terrific news. Now we cannot win the war because now we have an ally who has not been defeated in 3,000 years, by which he means the Japanese. Hitler even then could engage in self-delusion that was pretty amazing. He orders Goebbels to convene the Reichstag for later in the week. He's going to make a speech. And then on the morning of December 8th, he boards his train and heads for Berlin. The camera pops up and heads out beyond him, passes the train, heads over France, heads toward England, circles down into a place called Chequers, the prime minister's retreat, weekend retreat. On the night of December 7th, Winston Churchill is at the phone, is at the table telling a story, and the butler comes in and whispers in his ear. Churchill immediately jumps up, runs up the stairs, sits down on another telephone, grabs the phone, calls FDR, and says, "Mr. President, what's all this I hear about Pearl Harbor?" To which FDR responds, "It's quite true, Winston. We're all in the same boat now." And as Winston Churchill would write later, "I went to bed contemplating the vast economic and military might of the United States, and I slept the sleep of the saved and thankful." He then gets up on the morning of December 8th and tells his secretary to convene the parliament because he's going to make a speech and declare war on Japan to immediately show the Americans that he's right there with them. The camera then picks up and travels across the Atlantic Ocean, the vast and roiling gray sea, and heads for Washington, D.C., where it now spins down through the dank mist and fog that lay upon Washington on the morning of December 8th. It keeps going down toward the White House, through one of the windows on the second floor, where it picks up Arthur Prettyman, the president's butler, who is walking down the hallway carrying the president's wardrobe for the morning of December 8th. Long swallow-tailed coat, striped trousers. Franklin Roosevelt is going to dress in diplomatic clothes this morning because this is quite an important speech that he is about to make. The butler walks into the bedroom where FDR, as always in the early morning, is sitting up in bed. Sometimes he's reading papers, but today he is editing his speech for the day. And I like to think, as the scene unfolds, that he has just made what is perhaps the most famous edit in American history. He has crossed out the words "in world history," put in a little caret, and inserted the words "in infamy." That's right. A date that will live in infamy. And he says a few words to the butler and then begins the process of dressing the president for the day. And it isn't the process that normal people have, because Franklin Roosevelt, of course, suffers from polio, has no muscles below the hips. And so he must wear braces if he is to stand at a podium and hold himself up. And FDR refuses to appear in front of an audience except on his feet. And so he lays out, and the braces are put on his legs. 5-pound stainless steel braces hinged at the knee, fixed at the thigh with leather straps, and around the waist as well. It takes a while. Wearing them is a torment, but he refuses to ever appear without having those braces on. Then they put on the pants, then they dress him. They get him into his wheelchair, take him downstairs. Not only one leaf blower, but two. They get him downstairs where a limousine awaits. Now, there is an urban legend that I think is true, that the limousine that takes Franklin Roosevelt up to Capitol Hill that day is Al Capone's limousine. The reason for that, of course, is that the Secret Service had ordered new armor-plated limousines for the president, but they were still being produced in Detroit. And so the people in the Treasury Department said, well, you know, we did get Al Capone on income tax evasion, so we have a lot of his stuff. We've got this armored limo over here. How about this? And they said, fine, send it on over. And they brought the car over, and FDR was lifted into the car. And then on either side, 3 Secret Service agents. A dank, lousy, miserable day, but they all wore only sport coats, no top coats, because they wanted to be able to reach their pistols immediately if something went wrong on that 1 mile ride from the White House up to the Capitol. He headed out on Pennsylvania Avenue, which had been inspected once, twice, 3 times by the Secret Service. All the manhole covers had been welded shut. Along the length of Pennsylvania Avenue, there were soldiers every 5 feet watching the crowd. The crowd was large but quiet. The automobile came up onto Capitol Hill, went down into a hidden entrance that was used for the president so that he could be moved in and out of the car and into his wheelchair without being seen by the public. He was then wheeled up to the speaker's office, only stayed there briefly, and then headed in to give his speech. And all of that I've just described for you, I actually wrote. And then I said, I'm going to cut it all out, because the best place to begin the book is right here. It was the largest radio audience in history. On the cold coast of Maine, they were listening. Down on Wall Street, trading stopped so they could listen. On assembly lines in Detroit, they were taking long lunches so the auto workers could listen. In Chicago, the butchers stopped slaughtering in the stockyards to listen. In Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa, where they grew corn and wheat enough to feed the world, now that the rains had returned and the dust had stopped blowing, the farmers were listening there too. In all the places where the muscle and sinew of America bound one state or town or family to another, they were listening for the warm baritone and patrician inflections that never sounded too upper crusty coming out of the radio. Because America had awakened that morning to the cold reality of war. War in every time zone, war encircling the earth, war once more as the original human fact. In Hawaii, U.S. Navy battleships burned beneath great funerary clouds of black oil smoke. In the far Pacific, Japanese troops attacked along every line of latitude and longitude. In swirling blizzards of blood and snow, Russians and Germans slaughtered each other before Moscow. Across Europe, jackboots echoed and resistance guttered while U-boats stalked freighters on the roiling gray Atlantic. But Americans were listening because Franklin Roosevelt was about to make sense of it all. In Washington, the CBS radio announcer was describing the packed House chamber, the tense atmosphere, when suddenly his voice rose. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the president is appearing and moving toward the podium. And from out of deep bass consoles and tinny tabletop radios in every corner of the country, a roar exploded. Something between a cheer and an angry shout. The harsh, hard, ferocious cry of Americans lifting themselves from shock and drawing strength from the president who'd lifted himself from a wheelchair and by remarkable force of will was appearing upright before them. When the roar receded, the speaker announced, "Senators and representatives, I have the distinct honor of presenting the President of the United States." More cheers and shouts. Then Franklin Roosevelt's voice rang out firm, confident, indignant. "Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. In the West, radio stations had gone off the air the night before so that Japanese bombers couldn't home in on the broadcasts. but now Roosevelt's voice rolled across deserts, up and over mountain ranges, and down into the warm green dream of Southern California. Down along boulevards laid like gridwork atop lettuce fields and orange groves, down onto long, straight, relentless thoroughfares that ended where scrub-covered hillsides leapt up to define and divide the expanse of Los Angeles, down into offices and coffee shops and cars where people were listening, unaware that as Roosevelt spoke, a Nazi agent was shooting at targets in a local canyon and planning the most daring act of the age. Unaware also that before it was over, he would draw many of them into his dark orbit. See, it starts in the right place now. Because when you finish that first little bit, you're going to turn the page and get to the next bit very quickly. But now we are in the place where the novel really begins, which is in Southern California. And I chose Southern California because on December 8th, it too was a place where important things happened. The FBI began the process of rounding up first the Japanese nationals and their friends that they had been watching, arrested about 250, and then they went after the Germans and arrested by the end of that day about 60 or 70 Germans. And one of the places that they raided was a place called the Murphy Ranch, though there was no Murphy and it wasn't a ranch. If you drive out Sunset Boulevard, driving out through Beverly Hills and then Westwood and out into Pacific Palisades, you will eventually come to the entrance of the Riviera Country Club. And right across the street from that, going up the hill into that lovely neighborhood that's directly across the street, if you get up to the top of the hill, you follow around to the left, and you're suddenly on a fire road that takes you back into one of those deep, scrub-covered, wild areas that still exist in Los Angeles, even in the urban environment. And there is a 300-foot deep canyon to your left. And you're driving along the fire road, and suddenly you come to a great chain link fence. Now, this fence is still there. We saw it. We explored this place. I had read about this place in an article in Smithsonian or American Heritage, 8 or 9 years ago, long before I even thought that I was going to write this book. And I thought, well, what a great place to begin a novel. The FBI stops up there before they drive down into that canyon, which contains a compound which had been built by fascist sympathizers who had purchased the land in 1933 from the Will Rogers estate, because the canyon drops down and then rises up, and on the other side is Will Rogers State Park, which you can still visit in Southern California. And down in that canyon, you can see a couple of big fuel tanks and water tanks and the powerhouse and terraced gardens and poured concrete everywhere. And they had also engaged an architect who had designed a 40-room mansion, the plans for which can be found at the UCLA archives, a 40-room mansion which was to have been Hitler's Western White House. And these guys down in that canyon, members of the Silver Shirt League, the German-American Bund, the Ku Klux Klan, they all hung out down in this canyon. And they practiced down there. They practiced street fighting tactics. They practiced target shooting. And all of this was getting ready for something that they called Der Tag, the day. The day when they and all their fascist friends across America would rise up, start shooting the wrong people, and start putting the right people into power. This was going on in America in the 1930s and early 1940s. And not only that, but in downtown Los Angeles, at Figueroa and 15th Street, right about at the site of where the Staples Center is today. If you're watching the NBA games, the Lakers and so forth, that's where they play basketball. But right on that site, back in 1941, was a Bund Hall, a beautiful, beautiful building. You could walk into the Bund Hall, the German-American Bund, stand in the foyer, and to your left was the Aryan bookstore, where you could buy German guidebooks, German cookbooks, German literature, and any kind of anti-Semitic pamphlet you might hope to find. And to your right was the Gaststube, the German restaurant with the checkered tablecloths and the beer steins on the walls, and as the main decorative element, a large map that showed the movement of the German army across Europe. And directly in front of you was an auditorium just about this size, where at certain times of the year, like in April during the Fuhrer's birthday, they would have large swastika banners on either side, an image of the Fuhrer hanging over my head here, and they would celebrate that important day and march around in their jodhpurs and Sam Brown belts and so on and so forth. We might think these people are kind of comic opera Nazis, but they came up with some very nasty plans along the way, very few of which ever reached fruition. One of these plans, for example, was to engage disaffected American veterans, war veterans from World War I, the kinds of guys who had been frustrated, say, during the Bonus March. Engage those guys to rob the armories up and down the West Coast, collect the weapons, bring them to a centralized location so that when Der Tag arrived, they'd have a good stash of weapons to start their rebellion. That didn't happen. Another plan that they came up with was to kidnap Harry Cohn, Louis B. Mayer, Jack L. Warner, Samuel Goldwyn, all the Jewish movie executives, kidnap them all on the same day and take them up to a place above Los Angeles in a little town called La Cañada, where there was a park called Hindenburg Park, and hang them all. That one never got very far either. But one of the things that they did engage in on a fairly regular basis was to collect pamphlets, anti-Semitic pamphlets, and bring them to the tops of buildings on Hollywood and Vine and places like that where there was a lot of traffic, and start throwing them down onto the street. They called it snowstorming. Whenever a German vessel arrived from Berlin at Long Beach, the port of Southern California, someone from the Bund would go down there and go aboard the ship, or merchant ship, or an ocean liner, and they would meet the Gestapo agent who was aboard every vessel, and they would get plans that came to them from Berlin, and they would get literature, and they would get good old American cash with which to fund some of the nefarious things that they were involved with. Well, what a great fertile area to begin a novel on December 8th, right there in that Bund with that whole group. And of course, our German agent is hiding in plain sight within this organization, tapping them for cash when he needs to, and otherwise trying to keep under the radar. Well, that's why I begin it on December 8th in Los Angeles. But there's another reason that I begin the book on December 8th in Los Angeles, and that is because not only is it an amazingly significant day in world history, it's also an important day in the history of American culture, American popular culture. Because on December 8th, 1941, a bag of books and plays and screenplays arrived at Warner Brothers, sent out from their office in New York City. This material was to be assigned to young readers the young readers working for $1.12 an hour would read the books and the plays and render their opinions. It's called doing coverage. And it's a way that even today, young people can work their way into the movie business. If you can write good reports on the material, because don't forget, in Hollywood, nobody really likes to read. They like to, they like to have these stories told to them, but they don't like to read. That's an old adage from Hollywood. And of course, even in Hollywood, they'll insult each other. They'll say, "Oh, I was once looking at a new agency to go to. I was with an agent, and I said to him, I've just been invited to talk to the people over at William Morris." They said, "Oh, don't go to William Morris. They move their lips when they read over there." That's a sidelight, because what happened on December 8th, 1941, was that one of the plays that arrived and was given to a young reader to report on was a play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. He would, within 4 days, write a report, and he would say, colorful, tense mood, excellent melodrama, would make an excellent vehicle for George Raft and Mary Astor. Of course, George Raft and Mary Astor wouldn't be in it. Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman would. It would be Casablanca, and it would be released a year later in November of 1942, just at the perfect moment, because it was at the same time that the Allies were landing in Casablanca. So there was this wonderful synergy between what was going on in the real world and what was going on up on the screen. And if we look back at it today, we realize that of all of the movies that came out of Hollywood in the 1940s and World War II, this may be the greatest of war movies, and there are only 2 or 3 shots fired in the whole movie. And one of the things that I wanted to do for you when you sat down to read this book was to feel as if you were in a black and white 1940s movie like Casablanca. That's why the cover is in black and white. And I think I achieved that, because you have this sense in the beginning of the book that it's kind of film noir, Los Angeles and the dark streets. A lot of the action unfolds there. Then everybody's on the train that's heading to Washington, D.C., where the Nazi agent runs into the young reader, who is the guy who had written the report on Casablanca. And he's gotten himself into some trouble, and so he's heading back east. And then, of course, the climax is going to be in Washington, D.C., amidst the grandeur of the monuments of American democracy. But I didn't try to parallel Casablanca or give you a sense that there was any kind of one-to-one relationship between my characters and what happens in that movie. But there's a scene in that movie that's very important. It's the scene where Bogey has seen Ingrid Bergman for the first time back in the club. She's now left. The lights are all out. It's about midnight, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning. Bogey's sitting at a table with the bourbon bottle in front of him, and he's not very happy. Sam's in the background. Sam is playing on the piano, and Bogey says to him, "Sam, it's December 1941 in Casablanca. What time is it in New York?" And Sam says, "I don't know. My watch has stopped." And Bogart says, "I bet they're asleep in New York. I bet they're asleep all over America." And of course, the action of the movie from that point on is going to be Bogart awakening to his new responsibility, awakening from his sleep as the guy who sticks his neck out for nobody, to the guy who will make his noble act of self-sacrifice at the end and march off to do whatever he does with Claude Rains at his side. And in this novel, I think you are going to meet a lot of characters who are in many ways, people that are focused on their own lives. One of them wants to be an actress. One of them wants to be a writer. There is an FBI agent who is trying to figure it all out, and he's got his focus. And all of them are going to rise to the occasion. They are all going to be there in Washington in that last few days before Christmas Eve. And each of them will find within themselves, I hope, the same things that Bogart finds within himself, the conscience and the courage to do this, to answer this new call that a war against fascism is going to send out to everyone. There's one more reason that I wrote the book beginning on December 8th. And in order to talk about it, we need to go back to Winston Churchill. Churchill, on December 8th, as we said, immediately decided to declare war on Japan. He said, I'll wait until President Roosevelt is finished declaring war on Japan, and then I will do it to show my solidarity. Well, Japan declared war de facto upon the British by attacking British possessions before Churchill could even get back to London. So that was already taken care of. But Churchill on that day said to his cabinet, I must get to Washington immediately. He heard Roosevelt's speech. There was not one mention of Germany. Churchill said, we got to get him to turn on Germany. We agreed back up in Nova Scotia in the meeting that they had in August of 1941 that it had to be Germany first. And so the next day he sends FDR a telegram saying, would it not be prudent for me to come over so that we could meet face to face and settle some of the big issues that we are confronting? And FDR knew why he wanted to do this. FDR was very coy about it. He wrote back and said, dear Prime Minister, I'd love to see you, but it would be a very dangerous crossing and we can't spare you. FDR understood, however, that what he was in the process of doing was bringing the American people toward the realization that this was going to have to be a two-front war, first against the Japanese, but also against the Germans. In fact, on the night of December 9th, Tuesday night, he had a fireside chat. Now, we all think that those fireside chats that are now legendary were happening once a week. But across 12 years of presidency, he only gave 52 fireside chats. And this was one of them. He talked to the American people about the challenges ahead. But at the end, he said, it would ill behoove us to defeat the Empire of Japan, only to turn our backs and find that Germany and Italy were in control of the rest of the world. And then he said good night, letting the American people ruminate upon that possibility. The next morning, Churchill wrote to him again. There was a wire waiting for him, and he relented. He said, okay, if you think you can come over, come on over, and we will have a conference. And of course, the next day, on December 11th, Adolf Hitler, making good on what he had promised to Goebbels on December 8th, stepped in front of the Reichstag and gave a fiery speech, a self-pitying speech, a speech in which he eventually came to the point where he says, and we are going to turn on that country led by that man who makes his chats from the fireside while our German soldiers fight and die and freeze in the cold and snow. And the German Reichstag went crazy. The German General Staff said, we haven't planned for this. This is not a good idea. Hitler's point was that it was a de facto war, so let's make it a declared war. Well, Churchill, the next day, on Friday, got on the train from London, went up to Scotland, and boarded a British battleship for a 10-day crossing across the Atlantic with destroyer escorts traveling close to them and communication problems and terrible weather. That battleship plowed through those Atlantic westerlies for 10 days. Churchill wrote to his wife, "This is the worst 10 days of the war for me so far." One member of his staff fell and broke an arm. Another fell on the pitching ship and hit their head and had a concussion. Churchill, the whole way, dosed himself with Mother Sill's seasick remedy, entertained himself when he could not be in communication with the War Office by reading novels by C.S. Forester and watching Errol Flynn movies in the wardroom at night. Finally, the battleship arrived at the Virginia Capes, approaching Norfolk. The plan was for the battleship to sail up the Chesapeake up to a point where it would be met by a smaller vessel that would take Churchill up the Potomac to meet FDR the following morning, which would have been December 23rd. But on that Monday, December 22nd, as the battleship is approaching Norfolk, he says, "Get me a plane. I need to see Roosevelt right away. I need to get into his face as soon as possible so that we can start these conversations." And so they got him a plane in Norfolk, Virginia. Churchill, his bodyguard, Tommy Thompson, he only traveled with one bodyguard, Tommy Thompson, his doctor, Lord Moran, and his advisor, Lord Beaverbrook, were also on the plane. The plane takes off going up the Chesapeake at about 5:30 in the afternoon for the hours-long flight to Washington. And as the plane takes off, the men become transfixed by what they see out the windows. This has been written about in a couple of primary sources. They see the American landscape coming to life as evening comes on, and they are all stunned. Churchill turns to Tommy Thompson and says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see lights." They had not seen lights in 2 years at night. "I see lights. But more than that, I see freedom. I see hope." And the plane continued on, landed in Washington. FDR met Churchill. FDR was standing, holding himself up against the side of the limousine. Churchill bounded off the plane. They shook hands. They got into the car. They drove to the White House, where a single photograph was taken of them on the White House lawn, with FDR in the middle. When he was standing up, he was very tall. He approached 6 feet. FDR's military aide holding his arm on this side, and Churchill on this side. And the world the next morning saw this photograph in the papers, and they were shocked, because no one knew where Churchill was. The Germans thought he had headed for Egypt, and they were trying to find him there. But here he was in Washington, D.C. In my book, The German Assassin has made it to Washington, because believe me, folks, you don't write a novel with the White House on the cover and that gun sight aimed at the White House and not have the bad guy get to Washington. He's staying in the Hay Adams Hotel because he takes care of himself. He likes luxuries. He's staying in the Hay Adams Hotel, and he opens the paper and he sees this picture on the front page, and he says, "My God, they're both here. I can get them both in a single night. I can end the war right here with 2 shots." And of course, that's what he's going to try to do. And I know, and you know, that he doesn't succeed. When you read one of my novels, you know that I don't change history, but my characters are changed by history. So the action that unfolds in that last day should move fast enough and efficiently enough as you're turning those pages for you to believe at some point on that dramatic Christmas Eve that he is going to get them both. And you're going to be saying, "Oh man, I hope this doesn't happen, because if he kills those 2 guys, we're going to be in terrible shape." And it's not going to happen. My characters will rise to the occasion. The question is, though, who among them will live and who will die? But know this, on that night, and you can see this piece of video that I want you to look at on my website. There's a timeline on my website showing you significant pieces of video from the month of December 1941. And the most amazing piece of film is of the British newsreel camera, the British Pathé News Service, which was set up right next to the podium on the south portico of the White House on that Christmas Eve and left to run. There are 20,000 people admitted onto the lawn of the White House because FDR has said, I promised the American people I was going to do this a year ago. We weren't going to light it down on the ellipse. We were going to light it right here. So you Secret Service guys, you figure this out. So they got metal detectors, very primitive metal detectors, and passed 20,000 people through the metal detectors onto the lawn. The Christmas tree was right on the south lawn. You can still see this tree. It's still there. The camera rolls, and the camera is just left to roll. And you will observe what I think is one of the most amazing and intimate pieces of history that you'll ever see. FDR is there, totally unaware of the camera, looks at Churchill. Churchill looks at him. They whisper a few things. FDR finally steps into the microphone and says, and now for the 9th time, I light the living community Christmas tree of the United States of America. And he pushes a button and you hear bells ring. You hear the audience applaud, and the deed is done. Then he gives about an 8-minute speech. And then he calls on his old and good friend, Winston Churchill, who now steps to the podium and gives a fantastic speech about the importance of Christmas in this dark and ever-darkening world. And the final portion of the speech, of course, is filled with hope. He says, so let the little children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us grown-ups join in their unstinting pleasure before we return to the stern task and formidable year that lies ahead. Resolve that by our sacrifice, those same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and peaceful world. And so, in God's good grace, a happy Christmas to you all, and good night. And he steps back from the podium. And of course, this speech was being carried around the world on the BBC wire service, shortwave service. And the world was just stunned by the power of those two speeches, by the power of that final exit line from Winston Churchill. And they helped to make it a brighter Christmas in the United States. But just remember, if not for my characters, that Nazi bastard out there might have killed them both. So thank you all for coming. I hope you will, if you haven't read the book, I hope you'll get a chance to read it. Thank you. And I'd be glad to answer a question or two if anyone has a question or two to ask. I will just, yes. I've written a little bit about it in a novel called Annapolis in the Pacific Theater, a novel about the history of the Navy. By the way, it's probably the only single-volume novel about the history of a branch of the American military. If you know, see if I could get my arm around, I'd pat my back. But you know, there's a lot of the Pacific Theater that I would like to write about. But in my next book, I'm writing about how all that will end. You know, and what the book is called Chain Reaction. So you can use a little bit of imagination to see where that's headed. But the Pacific Theater is a massive story. You could spend your whole life writing about World War II. And I've taken a particular angle with this book and the next one, and probably one more after that, before I get around to writing the book that he keeps referring to. Charlie keeps referring to the book called Beacon Hill rather than Back Bay. But I'm planning to publish a book called Beacon Hill in 2030, which is the 400th anniversary of the city of Boston. So it'll be a good marketing ploy. I'll just leave you with this. When I was writing the Lincoln Letter, it's a novel that came out about 10 years ago about Lincoln and a lot of other characters around him. I was working very hard to finish the book so that we could publish it in September of 2012, which was the 150th anniversary month of the first promulgation of the Emancipation Proclamation, which figures prominently in the book. So it's January of that year, and I am working very late hours, and I hate working late hours. It gets harder and harder. And so I was working till midnight, and I was determined on this particular day to get my character to Ford's Theater on Good Friday night of 1865. And the carriage pulls up with my character in it. The character steps out, and I look up because by now I am the character. There's a movie playing in my head when I'm writing, and it plays in your head too, I hope. And the character looks up at Ford's Theater, and I describe the facade and the big lamps that were throwing big shadows on the facade and the soldiers who were sitting on the stoop playing cards. And I said to myself as I looked at my watch, oh, great, I'm done. I've made it to Ford's Theater, and it's midnight. Now I can go to bed. And just then, in my imagination, the door of the Star Saloon banged open, and an athletic-looking young actor with a mustache walked up the street just a short distance, stopped, turned, looked at me and said, "You don't want to go to bed yet, Bill. Come on inside and see what's going to happen now." And the camera of my imagination followed Booth in the door and up the stairs into the dress circle where he had his job to do and my character had his job to do. And I never went to bed that night in order to finish that scene. And I guarantee you that when you get to December 24th, 1941, you won't go to bed until you finish that chapter. So thank you all for listening. And thank you to my friend Betty Bono down here who came to hear me tonight and brought a couple of her novels, The Better Angels and Fear Itself. And I admitted to her that I at one time had planned to write a novel about the Civil War, the women in the Civil War, which I was going to call The Better Angels. But you beat me to it. And I used all that research in the Lincoln Letter anyway. So anyway, thank you. Thank you all. Take care.